Just like the state of South Dakota, schools across the state are struggling with their budgets. One of our viewers, Ethan, wants to know what programs you plan to cut to increase education funding.
Well, I think education funding we must look to the first dollars and the last dollars as we create our budget. As I mentioned, I have an education plan that's on my website, and I encourage people to take a look at that. And it's based on a number of ideas, but one of the ideas concerning funding involves building our budget first by funding the per pupil allocation fully, then looking to the other duties of state government, the other areas which must be funded, including Medicaid, and then to the extent that better economic times allow us to dedicate additional resources, those resources should be dedicated toward education. So sort of a first dollar and last dollar approach to funding.
Okay, Mr. Hennepin?
Well, I think we need to be clear. This administration's experience with education has been anything but positive. In fact, they've dismantled K through 12 education. K through 12 education was 39% of the budget when they took office. It is now 31% of the budget. The Lieutenant Governor likes to talk about the raw number of dollars that have gone to education as 80 million. Actually, 52 million of that was stimulus money. It wasn't local effort, it wasn't state effort. And in fact, in South Dakota, we spend about $4,800 per pupil for educating kids in K through 12. We spend about $30,000 a year to incarcerate an adult in the state of South Dakota. We have the lowest effort in terms of state government's support of K through 12 education in the country. The Capitol building in Pierre during any legislative session is evenly divided between those who believe spending on education is an expense and those who believe that spending on education is an investment. I'm clearly on the investment side of that question.
I agree that South Dakota's spending on education is an investment. Senator Heideprem wants to create the impression that the state's commitment to K-12 education has declined because the percentage of the overall budget that's dedicated to K-12 education has declined. The reason it's declined is because other parts of the budget have grown dramatically. Medicaid has grown 68% in the last 8 years, 68%. Now that does not change the fact that South Dakota is now spending more than $80 million more on K through 12 education than we did 8 years ago. Let me say that again. $80 million more is spent on K through 12 education than we did 8 years ago, and there are 3,000 fewer students in the K through 12 system.
52 million of that 80 million is stimulus money. I mean, and that's gone. And in fact, just in the last month, this administration accepted $26 million from the federal government specifically for education and then ignored the purpose that it was intended for and stuck it in the budget to mask the fact that government is so big and they refuse to reduce it. They did the same thing with $20.9 million in Medicaid money that should have gone, at least in part, for the stated purpose, and that would have been Medicaid. Instead, what they did is they stockpiled it for purposes of making the budget look better. This is an administration that's taken $300 million in stimulus money. So when they talk about how the reserves are as big as they were when they took office, add in $300 million to that equation, and then you understand why. But it's gone. It's gone.
And we do have some upcoming questions on Medicaid, but let's stick to education right now because I have some more about that. Is there anything else you'd like to comment regarding Mr. Heideprem's, what he just said?
Yes, again, I think it's important to remember that we are spending more money on education. Some of that money is stimulus money. Most of the one-time stimulus money should not be spent on ongoing expenses. So, for example, the $300 million that talk about during the budget number that you're bandying about there, 186 million of that is roads, and that's to be spent on one-time things, one-time money for one-time investments. Now, to suggest that we should take that one-time special education appropriation earlier this year and build it into an ongoing expenditure, I think is irresponsible. To take one-time money and build it into ongoing expenses will exacerbate the budget deficit next year.
How can you say it's irresponsible when you knew very well that that was the purpose of the money? I mean, that was the purpose of the $26 million, was K through 12 education. But instead, you stockpiled it to make the budget look better. $300 million, and we still have a budget deficit of $107 million.
The purpose of the money, as stated in the federal legislation, was to avoid firing teachers. That's happening in other states. It's not happening in South Dakota because of budget concerns. So to spend one-time money on ongoing expenses simply exacerbates our budget problem, and it's irresponsible.
Well, then why did you take it?
We took it, but we did not build it into ongoing expenses as you wanted done.
All right, we have a question from a first-year teacher. You talked about firing teachers. He asked, if elected governor, how can you assure me that you're going to offer me better opportunities than the states around us, such as Minnesota and Iowa?
These are teachers.
This is a teacher asking this question.
Teacher salaries are set by school boards, and they are responsive to market conditions. Certainly the state must provide funding as best we can to allow school boards to offer the best salary package. I do think it's important to look at all occupations in South Dakota and recognize that they are not as highly paid as in surrounding states because of a lower tax burden and a lower cost of living. I would rather make X dollars in South Dakota than that same dollar figure in Minnesota, because I know after taxes I have more money in my pocket. I also know that that money will buy more things because the electricity is lower, housing costs are lower, etc. So to simply look at the single dollar number and say it's comparable to other states and it's somehow wrong, that's not a good way to look at it.
Travis, you know as well as I do that what the Lieutenant Governor just said isn't true. That in fact, even after you adjust salaries for the absence of an income tax, you make substantially less in South Dakota than you would in Wyoming. That's why the university where we educate most of our educators, Black Hills State, we lose almost all of them to the west. We lose them to the state of Wyoming. It's a brain drain that's going on in South Dakota, and it's a tragedy. I don't really think there are many educators who have followed this campaign who really don't see the difference between the Lieutenant Governor and myself. As I've said before, here's the challenge. Shrink the size of state government, pay off the deficit, balance the budget without raising taxes, and then reinvest in kids and schools and roads and bridges.
We've been talking about K through 12 education funding, but funding for higher education is also an issue. South Dakota has the highest percentage in the nation of college students graduating with debt. Their average debt is around $23,000. Zane wants to know, what are each of you going to do to help lower tuition rates for students? And what will you do to make sure my generation and future generations can afford college? Because for many, the cost is becoming out of reach.
Is it Senator Heidbrum's first?
I would answer the question this way. In South Dakota, higher education faces a number of challenges. To me, education means pre-K all the way through to PhD. It's important that we consider the continuum of education from the beginning, terminal degrees that are available. Now, higher education has some opportunities that K through 12 does not have. Opportunities in terms of private fundraising, in terms of foundational support, in terms of grants and research that is important to the continuation of a lot of the purposes in higher education. So that's part of the challenge. But we also have to remember that South Dakota, while we have a high number of our post-secondary kids going into school, has about the highest rate in the country of kids who can't make it from the first year into the second year. And many times that's because of the incredible financial debt that they accumulate. We just learned in the last week what that means. South Dakota has the highest per student debt load in the country, and we have to deal with that.
Okay, Mr. Dugard.
I think Senator Heidbrun misunderstood the last point. If you read that article in the paper, it was the highest number of students with debt. With debt. In terms of percentage debt, I believe we're 17th. And I don't disagree with the notion that students
The national average is $24,000 per student. In South Dakota, it's about $23,000 that they graduate with in debt.
Okay. I guess I was referring to the newspaper article. In any case, South Dakotans' higher education system has, I believe, benefited over the last 8 years with additional investments. We have more PhD programs. We have significantly more research that's going on in our university systems. And this has created not a brain drain, but a brain gain, I think, that's been reported recently. Now, the question was related to cost. I don't find anything wrong with having some of our students incur some debt. Lynn and I both incurred debt to achieve our own higher education goals. all three of our children put themselves through college, and they had to take on debt in 2 out of the 3 cases. And I think that's good, because I think it instills in them a sense of financial responsibility. It requires them to know the value of a dollar. It requires them to look at work as a means of achieving their higher education goals. South Dakota's tuition increase last year was the smallest in a number of recent years. And I think if you look at our cost for attending an in-state college, it's still very competitive and a very good value compared to surrounding states.
Okay. We started to talk about Medicaid a little while ago. Medicaid, the number of people on Medicaid is surpassing the number of people on Medicare, in part due to the economy. However, the state did put $21 million in federal Medicaid money into the general fund instead of allocating it to services such as nursing homes. What can be done to ensure that South Dakota's poor receive adequate health care coverage paid by Medicaid?
South Dakota's general fund budget is